Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special episode of JTV. Today, we're joined by Max Radford, who you may recognize, but even more so when I show you this. This was a clip that we posted of Max. The video was called Pro-Israel Stuns Reporter with the Truth About Israel-Palestine, and it has gone pretty viral, not just on JTV, but also throughout the World Wide Web. And Max is here. He's joining us to talk more about this interview and the whole issue of Israel and the Middle East. In the interview, Max was an absolute pro at smashing the lies and the falsehood that surrounds the anti-Israel activism and campaign. And he so eloquently, and I think this is one of the reasons, Max, the video did so well, was that you so eloquently put forward Israel's case. And so what I wanted to do today was to both talk about some of the big issues that Israel is facing, the accusations that she faces, but really I want our audience to kind of learn from you about how Israel tackles the big issues, how we as Jews in the diaspora and supporters of Israel who will be watching this throughout the world can deal with the big issues that Israel faces. So first of all, just thank you for coming on here. And I'd love to start off by talking about something you said to me offline earlier, which was that before we start unpacking all the big questions around, Israel and all the issues that surround it, you said that there's something that's always at the back of your mind, which is a question of thinking in terms of the long term, thinking about the time ahead, and thinking in spans of time. And you said you think always for how the next 30 years are going to look. And part of the problem that we face, especially with Western politicians and how they approach Israel, but perhaps even people within the pro-Israel community, is that so much of the decision making, so much of the way we deal with things is short-termist, only dealing with the next year, the next month, the next week. And that so much deals with, and I thought it was so pertinent. So could you start off by talking about that and why you think this is so essential? Having a long-term plan is so essential to the whole question of how we deal with the Israel issue.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me on, and also for I guess spreading that interview, which was really kind of impromptu. There was no big plan to it. Someone just approached me for an interview, and I've got plenty to say, and I thought we'll just speak from the heart and give the truth. And that's what I did. But on your question about time, it's something that I've always thought about, and that is that people throughout the world, whether you're a person or a government or an institution, organization, or even a terrorist group, we all look through a different lens of time. So the vast majority of the population, and very much so in the West, are very, very short-termist in how they look at their daily life. I mean, the most important thing at that given moment is instant gratification. Whether it's your next holiday, what car you're going to buy, or who's going to win Love Island, it doesn't really matter. That's kind of where their focus seems to be at that moment. And then when you look, for example, at governments, politicians, whether they're in office or not in office, the time lens that they use is maybe 4 years or 8 years, to get elected or to stay elected. And they will pretty much sell their soul to do that, even if it's not stuff they believe in, if they believe there's a populist vote that they can capture to get into government and to stay in government. And they really apply that to their decision making, their rhetoric, and the politics of appeasement, which is pretty much what we have in the West now. And I guess I think Churchill coined that perfectly when he said, an appeaser is he who feeds a crocodile in the hope that he'll be eaten last. And that's certainly symptomatic of current governments in the US and the newly elected government in the UK, or as I call him, two-tier Keir, which we might talk about later. That's their lens of time. And then think about myself, and I've always applied a different lens of time, which for me is 30 years. And that's just a little bit more than a generation, but essentially it's because of my own family generations. So, my eldest is exactly 30 years younger than me. And I always think of what does the world look like when my children are my age. When I think about that, then you start to realize certain things. You start to see pictures, and then you start to formulate your opinions. And I've always used that, and I've tried to be a little bit ahead of things when I look through that time lens, and made certain decisions based upon that, which maybe I'll unpack with you. But then we have the lens of time, let's say from our adversaries or from other parts of the world. So, if you think of China, for example, they're very happy to play the long game. They don't look at world domination as a religious one, but certainly, they've applied different methodologies, and they're much more public about it now. I think if you know about Belt and Road, which they coined the phrase, I think maybe in 2013, but basically by establishing infrastructure or whatever it is into the West, they embed themselves in the day to day, and they become irreplaceable. And China has certainly done that through markets and through various things. Maybe with not quite as sinister a reasoning as what we're talking about today, which is the long game. I think being played out as far as the establishment of a caliphate, and how that plays out across the world. That's really where I really worry, because we all seem to have our head buried in the sand, and that's everyone that's short termist, right? So that's from the population to the media, to the politicians, to the governments. They're so short termist that they're kind of burying their head in the sand on what's actually going on. And that long game, when I think of my own family and I think of our own numbers, because I do believe in math, our math doesn't quite stack up, right? Because, on average, even as Jews in the UK, we probably average 2 children per family. So my family have 2 kids, who will then have 2 kids each. On average, is 8. Whilst when you're playing the long game and trying to establish yourself demographically, certainly across Europe and across the US now as well, and even Australia and various other places, the average may be 4 or 5, which means that that couple will essentially in one generation, 2 generations, produce 24 to 30. So if you think about that from a point of view of a voting public, and shifting policy, which is already happening here, the politics of appeasement, and everything that we're seeing, that lens of time, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think we need to be aware, but we also need to be really, really brave. I think bravery is what's missing, and I think they always say that peace is peace of the brave, and I'm not seeing a lot of it in the West, and certainly not in the media.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
And I think, by the way, that when I think of October 7th, it, it really started, this the radicalization of Gaza. You should go back to 2005. You think about that, was 18 years earlier, and Douglas Murray talks a lot about this as well. He says, they had 18, Israel disengaged from Gaza, and you could make the case that it was really short-termist move to placate the international community and to just try to just leave what was basically a very difficult area for Israel to be in control of. And what do we get? Douglas Murray basically said, yeah, it's not as you would define a generation, 30 years, but they could raise, it was 18 years from the disengagement to October 7th. They had 18 years to raise people, babies to 18-year-olds, to become modern day Nazis, basically. And so I think you're absolutely right that so much of the problem comes down to people, a culture that here in the West simply isn't able to look at the longer term, the long game.
yeah,
So
I mean, that's really that it's true that you say from 2005, but there's a combination of things there. Maybe there's an element of false hope, and that we hope that the aspiration of the people in Gaza, when we disengaged in 2005, was for them to go forward with a better life, and we left them with that opportunity from factories to everything that we could to enable that. But of course, they were playing a different game, a much, as I said, longer term game. but also maybe a more political or strategic mistake that was made when we did that
Yeah,
is
but people
thinking that
did
we are.
foresee it.
Well, we were the thought process. I think was that we were going to back one enemy against the more evil enemy, and actually that didn't work
Mm.
out because
Yeah,
Hamas was not established to for the destruction of Israel. Hamas was established for the destruction of Fatah,
yeah,
and that was the job that they were doing. And Israel obviously were happy in some way to participate in that, and obviously that was now a gross miscalculation, and now we're kind of paying the price. I don't think that was politically motivated. I think it was a hope mistake.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and that's kind of what we're seeing now. Where you like you say, 18 years on, 18 years of subjugation by Hamas of the people in Gaza, yet the people in Gaza are, and the children of Gaza have been so indoctrinated over that time that truth and fiction, which is where I started that interview, just
yeah.
just
Well,
are completely separated.
Well, truth and fiction is exactly where I want to go next because I want to start. There's so many topics that we've discussed and that we can discuss over several conversations. But I think that one of the things people loved from your video was just seeing how you were able to debunk the myths, demystify, and separate the truth from fiction. And so I want to do that. I know that we've been discussing that lost some friends or people that you've admired over being shocked at the lies that they've believed about Israel. And you've been brave enough to stand up and speak the truth, and you do so clearly and uncompromisingly. So let's go through some of them and let's learn from you and how we tackle some of these falsehoods. The first one I think should really be surrounding Israel's rebirth. It's sort of like the original sin that I think they say allows the anti-Israel side to justify almost anything. The resistance by any means, celebrating after October 7th because, well, Israel's in the wrong. It's a concentration camp in Gaza and all those heinous, disgraceful lies, especially given our history. But I wonder if we could start off with the very issue of original sin, that Israel coming into being was somehow a colonization project, that it's somehow, taking someone else's land and it was just barbaric thievery. Why don't we start there? Because so much stems from that.
Yeah, so that's interesting because one can say there's truth, and then other people say there's our truth and their truth. There should only be one truth, but of course, over time, if you're subjected to continuous lies and misinformation about anything from so many different directions, your truth, your own truth, is the one that you've just been hearing all of the time. So that's one of the things that I mentioned in that interview is the numbers, is the volume. Okay, so being so small, being that as I said, there's 2 billion Christians and 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. There's only 15.2 million Jews. So our power of amplification and our myth that we own the media, I wish we did actually, because maybe we can give them some truth. But it is kind of ludicrous. But that
Mm,
amplification is now with so much volume that their truth is one that they believe in, and we have a real difficulty with that. So when you
yeah,
think about things like and I love that you use the phrase that we discussed earlier, the rebirth of Israel. That's important in itself,
mm,
right? One thing that is very different about Israel than almost all other countries, major countries, we are the only non-colonizers. Everyone has colonized. Okay, the Brits have colonized, and the Americans have colonized. The French have colonized, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Germans, the Spanish. Okay, everyone has colonized.
and the
Uh,
Arabs.
and then of course the Arabs have has been one of the biggest colonization projects there is. I think there are 22 Arab countries, but the colonization is not just by countries. Okay, so you can colonize by way of ideology and religion. So this is really, really an interesting part because why are there only 15.2 million Jews? I mean, we're the one of the oldest religions. You think there'd be more of us, but the reason there isn't is because Judaism is one of the few, if not the only, non-proselytizing religions. Essentially, we don't preach to anybody that isn't Jewish. Whilst Christianity and Islam sent missionaries across the globe and forced people to convert, okay, by the millions, by the many millions. So that is the reason that today you have 2 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims, and very few Jews. Um, Interestingly, just on that particular religious point, which I find really interesting, is that just little nuances, because these religions are very close to each other, okay, in respect of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But one thing that's really different between, say, Judaism and Christianity is how Christianity says, do unto others as you want done unto you, more or less. And Judaism says, don't do unto others as you don't want done unto you. They sound the same, but they're not. One enforces yourself and pushes yourself on others and forces them to think and do and believe what you believe, and the other one just doesn't. And so that's why we have 15.2 million. So interestingly,
I
the
think it's also,
only
by the
non
way, the
yeah,
population issue is also partly down to persecution and being dispersed and facing
well, that's
massacres. That's
well,
part of
that's
it
the
as
knock,
well.
well, that's the knock-on effect of being small in numbers, right?
Yeah.
First of all, we were dispersed many times throughout history, but then we've always been a minority wherever we've been, wherever we were dispersed to, and a minority is always the scapegoat in hard times. And you can see that right throughout history. Not to mention going to obviously. Don't forget that the Second World War and the Holocaust followed the Depression of 1929, and of course, tough economic times that followed. Of course, a scapegoat is needed. And that was the motivation that fueled the rest of the people to join that project, say in Germany. So we've always been a minority, and we've paid the price of being non-proselytizing. So kind of going back to the colonization thing, that is the interesting bit. We're the only non-colonizers. We didn't send missionaries anywhere. We haven't taken any over any other lands. We just had the rebirth, if you want to call it, returning to Israel. Not everyone, because many people were there already. My own family's birth certificates say Palestine. They don't see Israel, but it was a Jewish Palestine. It's a birth certificate in Hebrew. But this myth of colonization, amplified by all of everything that we've just spoken about, through the mouths of and social media and mobile phones and media across the globe, means that truth plays no part.
Mm.
That lie has been told so often that has become their truth. And if you now marry that to the short termism that I spoke about before, well, the liberal minded of this world are also very lazy and very short termist. So they think that they are joining a good cause, but they are not joining a good cause. If they're liberal minded, bear in mind that Israel was built on a socialist ideology, kibbutzes included, you would think that they would be standing behind us. So when I give that interview in Piccadilly Circus, and there's a few hundred of us standing there, whilst there's 100,000 pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, whatever you call, marching through the streets of London, I bet you that more than half of those were not British Muslims. They were just British so-called liberals who are actually standing on the wrong side. Why? Because they don't know the truth, and we just don't have enough power behind us to, in numbers, to push out the truth as much as we try.
Absolutely, and well, that's why we have to keep doing what we're doing, and hopefully try and get more into the algorithm and tell the other side of the story. So the colonization thing, but I want to also get specifically into this idea of what happened in '48, because you touched on it when you were speaking to that reporter. This notion that Israel somehow came there, the Jews came there, kicked out the population that were in there, and just created this colonial state. Specifically on that accusation, what are some of the key things that you would push back with?
Well, of course, we know that that's very far from the truth. And I think we need to separate between small factions, okay, and then let's say leadership and government, right? So what factions will do on their own ideology is different from what the ruling power might do. Okay, so just for example, Hamas are the ruling power, and they were a faction, but essentially the population subscribes to that one ethos. If you look at 1948, and we were talking about the the Arabs that lived in Palestine at the time, which is why I say there were Palestinian Arabs and Palestinian Jews. They certainly do not own the term Palestinian. In fact, they didn't even identify as Palestinian at that time. They didn't have a flag till 1964, which is a long time after. So, but there were Arabs in the land that living amongst the Jews. The wars and the incidents and the massacres have been long running, way, way, way before independence. But it's important to understand that the opportunity for essentially everyone to live in one state and coexist was always there. It always existed. In 1948, when we declared independence, that was still the case. Of course, Ben Gurion with the Haganah, they were liberal-minded, and actually was always offered for the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs and the Palestinian Jews, to coexist. There were factions like the Irgun, which were much more right-wing, and yes, they did do certain things that may have ousted certain Arabs from certain places or certain events that happened. No question, there's no denying that happened. But that wasn't policy, and that wasn't everyone, and by no means the majority.
And also,
So,
you have to accept, you have to take into account the context of the time that they'd been facing a decades-long war of, annihilation from the Arabs in that area, who said we simply do not want to accept a Jewish state, which the Jews had every right to. So, I'm not, you can't ignore that context, the fact that they were literally facing all-out war.
well, we have to go just a little bit before that. Okay, so if we don't need to look at 1948. That was just the Declaration of Independence and the
Yeah,
next set of wars. But you have to look a little bit further, because whilst the Holocaust was going on, okay, and prior to the Holocaust going on, don't forget, Hitler was already engaged with the Grand Mufti, okay, I think Al Husseini, and they'd already had an agreement that whilst we will go and do the Holocaust and deal with the Jews in Europe, the Grand Mufti promised that he will deal with all the Jews in the land of Israel. He will ethnic cleanse essentially Palestine from the Jews. So that process already started, and that process was also by way of war. So whether it was from the Egyptians and King Farouk, I believe it might have been, didn't just start with Nasser that I mentioned in the interview. That was from 1967, when all the surrounding Arab armies came to essentially ethnic cleanse the land from the Jews. But that process had already started prior to independence, and that is why so many of the Arabs, or the Palestinian Arabs, let's call them that, left the land, right? Because there was war coming, and essentially they thought it was going to be a very easy job because we were small in numbers. So this started way before 48. So
yeah.
this notion of Israel colonizing and removing the Arabs and the Palestinian Arabs from the land is untrue. A lot of that was by choice. They by instruction by the surrounding, colonialist Arab armies. So that's really what was going on. That, of course, then followed on to, the war in 1948, which again saw disbursement of more Arabs because of the war that they launched. And that happened time and time again. 1967 was obviously a huge one, because that's when the Arab armies got together on all borders, and that was their ultimately, they thought, their day of victory, and ultimately their biggest failure. And even then, peace and coexistence has always been on offer. 7 times, I believe, we've
Yeah.
offered them a coexistence. And if you want to debunk a myth, not on our side, is this myth of the two-state solution being something that the Palestinian Arabs want and Israel doesn't. And that is an absolute myth. It's the exact opposite. Israel are the ones that have wanted it. They turned down coexistence under Ben Gurion, but a two-state solution has always existed. Whether it's the partition plan or whether it's Israel giving up land for peace over and over in order for them to have a democratic, but at least a Palestinian state. So they want a one-state solution. a one-state solution with all Jews dead. Why? Because it's not about land and it's not about religion, it's about ideology. And that ideology is far bigger than anything that Israel is even about. It's a much,
Yeah.
much bigger picture. This is the long game that I'm talking about that exists, that the
Yeah.
West and everyone else have kind of buried their head in the sand, pretending it's not going on.
Yeah.
Although I do believe they're starting to wake up.
I hope you're right. Do you think that, given that the Palestinian flag, that the identity they've created, in their own words, it has really been about, not about some genuine call for nationalism. It's about an ideology, as you say, that simply cannot accept a Jewish state, Jewish sovereignty in that land. Do you think, therefore, we need to rethink whether we use this term Palestinian in regard to the Arabs of this area when, in their own words, the construct is merely a cynical ploy to get rid of Israel?
So it's a great question, and actually, this is what I mean about looking ahead. So I had this conversation and subsequent email that I'd sent to a deputy ambassador of Israel in the UK at the time, quite a good few years ago,
Mm.
talking about language and narrative, and saying that we need to change the narrative because this is a world of sound bites,
Mm.
soundbite politics, soundbite social media, and what we don't have is consistency and uniformity and the power of repeat, repeat, repeat. Okay, so it doesn't matter what you ask, whether it's a politician or a spokesman or something that represents the Palestinian Arabs, they will give you the same answer every time, including they're killing our children and killing our women, and that's it. If you can ask them what day of the week it is, that will be the answer that you get. Whilst we just say all kinds of other things other than, and we are now guilty, and I say we, Israel and the Hezbollah, and are guilty of using their own terminology. Okay, so when a spokesperson or a politician is interviewed on BBC or Sky News or CNN, and the interviewer asks them a question and says the Palestinians, it should have been an automatic response to say, "You mean the Palestinian Arabs?" Because they don't own the word Palestinian. They've just started calling themselves that to delegitimize Israel, right? When someone says the West Bank, or worse still, the occupied territories, the default answer should immediately be, when you say the occupied territories, do you mean Judea and Samaria where Jews come from, right? But we are now guilty of doing that. And we've allowed even governments to do that. If you go onto the UK government website and it tells you about travel information, or whether you go on to I don't know, a phone company's information about what your cost of phone calls is, it says Israel and the Palestinian occupied territories. I mean, why is it using the word occupied?
Yeah.
Actually, legally not occupied. There is no law that says that it's occupied. There are recommendations that maybe come from the UN that might say that, but UN is motivated in a different way.
Yeah.
So it's not right. So why would the government UK website refer to the occupied territories when there are none? So interestingly, if you want to talk about occupiers, well, the Palestinian Arabs occupy Gaza, which is Egypt, or originally Egypt, or they occupy the West Bank, which is Judea and Samaria, or they occupy Jordan, which is probably a return home for many of them. So again, information is just repeat, repeat, repeat. And this is what everyone is subjected to. And the irresponsibility of, especially media and the politics of appeasement is what's just fed what we are seeing now
And Max,
without.
sometimes people feel, oh gosh, I can't say that. It's too provocative. It's too much against the status quo. If you watch people who speak like you do, you just tell the truth in an uncompromising way, people do respect it. And actually, you get more of people's attention because it's so different to what they've heard before.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we have a struggle. Okay, so I'm not sure if the video got stuck there.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Um,
You're good.
we have a struggle, and we have the struggle of the power of amplification. Okay, just due to our numbers, and we do need to speak that truth. But our biggest challenge is to get that truth outside of our echo chamber. Okay, whether it's our social media channels or anywhere else that we speak, generally the people that are following and watching are motivated one of two ways: either to their supporters already, okay, so that's preaching to the converted, or they are ones that are actually motivated by some other dark forces, which certainly exist across the internet and the web, to kind of destroy and debunk and sabotage anything that we do. We
Yeah,
absolutely struggle with getting that across. We can use truth and honesty, but and this is our great hope. Whilst these are kind of what feel like very dark, doomist days and everything that's going on, our hope is that we can get that message across. But hope needs help, and that help needs to come from places that have real impact outside of our echo chamber.
yeah,
We already know the problem with governments because they're short termists and they are will just go for the voters. There is no reason for lots of things that happen in politics, and certainly the politics of the left are very different to the politics of the right. This ability or this attempt to essentially gather the younger generation to make them voters is so extreme that they're even talking about making voting ages 16.
yeah,
Or I mean, what are the two things that the British government wants, or not the British government, but certainly under Corbyn and the Labour Party have tried to promise in the past, was free tuition. What did the Democrats do when they come in and Joe Biden wanted to wipe out debt? Why? Because they just want to buy these voters, these young voters, for their future. We have a real problem because we don't have um, anyone that's not short termist in
yeah.
those positions of power.
Yeah, it's amazing. It,
Um,
it actually reflects so much of the problems of society today, not just politically, but morally, mental health wise. Everything has just become so short termist. I want to talk about some specific things that are happening, particularly now. Fast forward to today and this war and post October 7th. Um, one of the big accusations, and to me, it's just so jaw dropping, is that you can have this accusation of genocide when genocide is what Israel's faced, not just on October 7th, but throughout all of Israel's history, throughout all of Jewish history. And that Israel has shown surgical precision in Gaza, I think to a fault actually, because it's costing Israeli soldiers' lives on the altar of protecting many civilians who are actually very much complicit. I'm not saying they all are, but there are many who are complicit with Hamas, and we have plenty of evidence to back that up. Including an Al Jazeera journalist that was decrying Israel's war in Gaza, meanwhile imprisoning hostages, which we now have discovered. And it is just, to me, so heinous that you could have something like the ICC going, looking into whether Israel's committing these crimes and people talking about it. I wonder if you could just reflect on that and some of these just totally blind accusations that Israel faces.
yeah, well, there's two parts to that, I think, because everyone's got their own motivations. Okay, so first of all, the notion of genocide and Israel committing genocide, well, we know what this is all about. They didn't invent this. It's called the inversion of morality, right? And that's the same thing that the Nazis did. Basically, do something, commit a heinous crime on someone, and then blame them for it. Completely change the story. That's what they're doing. I mean, and the irony of this is that unlike the Nazis, who hid what they did and attempted to hide what they did, so empowered and motivated by the volume that they can achieve, and I'm talking about this ideology and this Hamas, who are charter, which is basically written in there to commit genocide against Israel and to kill all the Jews and take over the land. They're totally open about it. And then there's that next level, okay, which is about the establishment of the caliphate. They're totally open about it. They're not hiding it. And even with them saying it, the politics of the appeaser and the West and social media have their eyes closed, pretending that it doesn't exist. So much so that believing that Israel committing genocide on the people of Gaza. I don't think it was an act of genocide when we moved out of Gaza and we left them factories and infrastructure to make a better lives for themselves. That's not an act of genocide. An act of genocide is when you sabotage that, you burn it to the ground, and you continue in your holy war. So when Israel are going to do what they do, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, this war would have been over on October the 8th. But the reality is that that is not Israel's objective. So we put our soldiers at risk, we put our country at risk, we put our people at risk, and we go and we send text messages and drop leaflets and do, roof taps that our army do to basically make sure that their civilians get out of harm's way, to essentially get the terrorists and deal with Hamas. Of course, who escapes with that? Hamas does. So, there's no genocide going on there. And then when you look at the ratios, and there's been plenty of people that are in much more knowledge than me, army included, there is a ratio there somewhere between 3 and 9 to 1 in urban warfare by other armies of how many civilians to combatants and terrorists are killed. Whilst Israel's ratio is less than 1 to 1, which is unheard of, given the fact that this is the only people in the world who hide behind their own people, who hide behind their children or under them.
How
And
can
even more,
such lies pervade when we have the truth so clear?
well, first of all, just to add to that, the cynicism of all of that is, what is the motivation? What is the motivation for the leadership of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza? What is their motivation for their own people to die? They're not that interested, and I'll tell you why they're not interested. Because their leaders were actually not Palestinian Arabs. Okay, whether it was Ismail Haniyeh, who was finally eliminated last week, who was Egyptian. But look at Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat was not Palestinian either. He wasn't a Palestinian Arab.
Yeah,
He died a
yeah,
billionaire, and his wife is now a billionaire living in Paris, with $1 billion that he stole from the people of the Palestinian Arabs. And now you've got something like $11 billion that has been stolen by the leaders of Hamas, living outside of, living in Doha or in Qatar in a hotel. So this methodology of launching attacks against Israel, ensuring that there is their own suffering, pretending that it's this kind of jihadist war, okay, that we of sacrifice, these martyrs, and then the oxygen given to, but I know we're going to come to this about media, to basically tell the story and the narrative the way they want, so that the world sends aid money, and that aid money then gets either repurposed for building tunnels and rockets to start the next attack, whether it's 6 months, a year, or 2 years later, and take the money for yourself. So they are billionaires living outside of Gaza and outside of the West Bank. Even Mahmoud Abbas is worth hundreds of millions of dollars from a construction company that I very much doubt he owns. Okay, but he's just been taking money that's coming from aid money all over the world. Just understand, there are 1.6 billion, let's say, Muslim population and 22 Arab countries, some of which have extreme oil wealth that are happy to fund it. And then you've got the naive blind West that are looking to them as a market. Okay, we are not a market. Jews are not a market with 15.2 million people, but
yeah.
they are indeed a market. So everyone's quite happy to sell their souls to the devil, and that's kind of what we've got going on in the West right now. As I said, the politics of the appeaser, and we are we're confused. As Jews and as Israelis, we are confused. We are confused as to how there's a man in the street that is not one way or the other, not Jewish, not Muslim, not pro or anti. How do they not get it? It's so plainly obvious. You even voiced your own frustration. How do they not get it?
Yeah.
And they don't get
Well,
it because they don't
thi-
have real information. They
and
don't.
this leads to the next point that we discussed offline, which is in terms of the information war. You cited two organizations that you felt are critical in Israel's war of information and all that, which was the BBC and the UN. Do you want to talk a bit about that and why you identify those two in particular as being so crucial in the information war?
Yeah. So if you want to put the UN and BBC somewhere in the dictionary, they probably should be under the definition of irony, because their support for, or seeming support for, the Palestinian Arab cause is kind of bizarre, because for me they are the reason that the people of Gaza and the Palestinian Arabs suffer.
Mm.
They are fundamental to their suffering. And let's separate for a moment between the BBC and the UN. The BBC, for me, are more responsible than any other media organization in the world for the suffering of the Palestinian people. Not being anti Israel, suffering of the Palestinian people. Why? Because they are the ones that are seen as the so called neutral media organisation, non-commercial, which of course they may be in respect of BBC One and BBC Two in the
Yeah.
UK, but they are absolutely commercial in what they do outside
Yeah.
outside of the UK. And they hide behind that mask, that cloak of neutrality, which is false. And that means that when they say something or they publish something, that's like the stamp of approval for pretty much every media organization out there, most of which the others are commercial, to essentially rehash it.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're one end or the other, if you're CNN or NBC or your Fox, either one, they are very open about their bias and they're commercially motivated, so they speak to their audience. BBC is not that, allegedly. So
Allegedly.
the BBC could change the narrative, but they're not motivated to change the narrative because ultimately it is a market for them. If you go into a hotel or anywhere around the world and you see which TV station is on that TV in your hotel room, it will generally be BBC, BBC World, BBC America, BBC Arabia, or CNN. Okay, so they are motivated to provide the information the audience will want. Truth plays no part. So the BBC, I think, is hugely complicit in being a vital cog in this misinformation cycle that leads to another incident, another war, more rockets sent, another intifada, whatever it may be. War sells. Peace does not sell. Peace will sell a few column inches for a week at best. War can sell for months. So that's one huge problem, and the BBC, has this kind of agenda which has gone on forever, and no one's brave enough to change it. And I wish that as a collective, and I'm talking about UK collective, we are able to move the BBC away from having us pay for what they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well,
that's
there
a
are
much
some
big.
calls for that. There are
There
some
are,
calls. We see
it's not
defund the
big enough,
BBC. Yeah. It's very
because
small.
where did the calls come from? And this is
Yeah.
where our confusion lay. This isn't an Israel problem or a Jewish problem. It is actually a problem, even in British politics
Yeah.
right now. It is
Yes.
a problem.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the BBC.
Yeah.
And I think that they were, as I said, a vital part of this. That if they change their narrative, just imagine a world where the world media, every time there is a terrorist incident by Hamas against Israel, just came out against them. It's terrorism. They would come out against it if it was anyone else. But when it comes to Jews, no Jews, no news, then of course they don't come out against them. Imagine they did. What would happen? First time, they'd get upset. Second time, they'd get more upset. Third time, they need to rethink. They need to rethink, because this is now not delivering them the money and the aid and the support globally that they want. That would change a change of direction, a change of course. And maybe that in turn would lead to them not using their own children in wars, and not subjugating their own people to suffer, because they make no currency from it.
Yeah.
So that's for me a key part. If you go to the UN, the UN is probably the most ineffective, I would say even corrupt organization there is. They are more complicit in
Wow.
suffering in this world than any other organization. They
Wow.
are not now operating on the foundations that they were built.
Wow.
If one ever listens to the fantastic podcast between Eitan Chitayat and Hillel Neuer, who's obviously a thorn in the UN side, and explaining how the UN actually works. It is basically a cartel of horse trading. So there are many, many countries there. Each country has a vote, excluding the veto of the major countries on major resolutions. But essentially, each country has a vote, and everyone is essentially selling their own vote for their own influence. Okay, so essentially, what they're saying is, we're going to propose this particular resolution. You vote for us. Next time you do something, we vote for you. And that horse trading is going on across, and every country that's in the UN, whether they have 50,000 people living in it or 300 million, have one vote. The same. So the UN, the people in the UN are just motivated by keeping their jobs, living in New York, where the UN headquarters are, getting funding from the major, especially the US and other countries, then putting in organizations like UNRWA, which is basically an arm of Hamas rather than an arm of the UN, who have facilitated keeping the Palestinian Arabs as refugees for 75 years. They don't need to be refugees. We've all been displaced at times, and we've all just assimilated. They've stayed in refugees in every country that they're in, including in their own country. They're still categorized as refugees. And then you look at the UN and you say, oh, it doesn't even say Palestine. Their little plaque in front of them at the UN says the state of Palestine. Well, it isn't a state, yet it's sitting there for everyone to see. It's completely false. But this is part of the long game, Ollie. This is what I'm talking about. If you keep consistency and narrative and words and language, and you just continue to disseminate it and distribute it everywhere you can, okay, in the end, that becomes their truth. And unfortunately, their truth is what the so-called liberal-mindeds in the West are hooked into. And
Well,
they
I
really
think
are.
that absolutely. I think that's actually a great place to finish today's discussion, because this has to be the one, I think, the most important takeaway from what you did and what you're doing. The interview you did with that reporter, you changed the narrative and you kept saying it, kept at it again and again and again with the truth, changing the narrative, and it cut through. And the other side, the anti-Israel side, the Palestinian side, have had massive PR success despite trading in lies, because they've kept at it again and again and again. I think that's going to be the key message here. We have to keep sharing the truth, and hopefully you get enough people on board, enough people sharing it, where you get to like a critical mass where it starts to really cut through. Max, there's so
That's,
much more we can... Go on.
yeah, can I just say that that's the message that I kind of finished that interview, and maybe we can do the same here, is about waking up.
Yeah.
Okay, who do we want to wake up? As I said, it's not about our echo chamber, right? It's about outside of it. We need to wake up all of those people in Europe, as an example, okay, who watched the Eurovision Song Contest, saw Israel receive virtually no votes from any country from their media organizations, who are petrified of repercussions, because this is all motivated by fear. What's going on in Europe and the West is motivated by fear, okay? The fear of repercussion. Whether it's two-tier care and what the police are doing is because they fear what some people will do. They don't fear us because we won't do anything. So fear is critical. But how do you wake them up? And I'll tell you where my hope
Do you not
comes
think it's
from.
also ideology, by the way? Do you not think it's also ideology that leads to two-tier policing, where you look at one side as always in the wrong, one side is always in the right?
Not really. There's a fear of ideology, the fear of their ideology. Everyone knows. It's just, okay, when the Second World War happened and the Holocaust happened, and the world armies, then went to war with Germany, they didn't come to save the Jews. That could have happened a lot earlier. They didn't
Yeah,
come to save
yeah,
the Jews, they came to save themselves.
yeah,
So
yeah,
the wake up moment now is when they're coming to save themselves. Like,
yeah.
this is kind of where we're at now. How do we wake them up to actually realize that this is not about Israel? This is not about Jews. This is not about anything other than this big overarching ideology. We need to wake up those millions of people across Europe, hundreds of millions of people possibly across Europe, who, when it came to the Eurovision Song Contest and they were safe behind their own sofa with their mobile phone and a text and a credit card, they voted for Israel. So we went from kind of bottom to top at that moment. 17 countries gave Israel 12 points. No countries gave Israel 12 points as far as the media, but the population did. How do we wake up those masses? That's where our hope is, and that is where the wake up world is. I've been using hashtag wake up world for a decade, pretty much after every message. Wake up world. We need to wake them up. And for anyone watching this, this isn't any longer about listening and just consuming. This is about using your voice. You need to distribute. You need to speak up. You need to believe in the ripple effect because we're swamped. So you should all do it. It doesn't have to be my message, but any message that you see, don't be scared to share it, to post it, to push it out there. You have to do it. Maybe that's where our power can come from. That's where our amplification can come from. And maybe that's where our solution lay. Because if we do that, we start to change public opinion. And public opinion starts to change political opinion because suddenly you're speaking to a different audience. And then maybe we see change.
Yeah, well, that's a great point to end on. And I want to say to our viewers watching this, if there's something else you'd like to hear Max unpack, please do comment in the YouTube video comment section and we'll look at it and consider it for future content. But Max, absolutely an enlightening discussion. Would love to have you back on JTV if you'd be up for it. And thank you for all you're doing to share the truth of Israel's cause. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. And all I can say is we just hope, Hatikva.
That's it. That's always been the Jewish way. Thanks so much.
Thank you
so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.